Joel, in many ways, needs little introduction. Director of Evangelical Alliance from 1997 to 2009, 10 years of leadership at Micah Challenge, named CBE in the Queen's Honours List in 2019, and recently awarded a doctorate from Durham University. Joel, we're thrilled that you could be with us, and please help us to think about what it means to be a missionary disciple in this strange, abnormal world that we're living in.
Ben, thank you, Ben Paul. Thank you very much indeed for this very humbling and exciting invitation. Great to be with the CTE family. When we moved from a physical meeting to a virtual meeting, you had a great excuse to get yourself another speaker, but I'm grateful that the invitation stuck. Missionary discipleship in a COVID landscape invites all kinds of reflections. Immediately, the juxtaposition between missionary and discipleship is a whole conference in itself. I know that there are many quarters in which the term missionary, the very ideology of missionary, is coming under question. And I think in a kind of post-colonial awareness culture, that might well be a part of what occupies our thinking in the course of these days. It may not, but it's certainly something which is around. And equally, I think the notion of disciple could do with some renewal, could do with some interrogation. I always think that the individuality of the discipleship concept could sometimes be swapped with the idea of citizenship or disciple citizen, in order to move us from the privacy of old paradigms of discipleship into a much more engaging missional context with the 21st century. But that as it may, I think we are faced with a very interesting kind of dynamic in bringing these two things together. And certainly I think it's so important, and I was really pleased, Ben, that we recast the subject in the light of COVID. And how will the church respond to discipleship, missionary discipleship in the COVID context? Could be filled with all kinds of ecclesial discipleship ideas. By that I mean an understanding of a missionary disciple which fits within our denominational and theological and liturgical straitjackets. But how will the church reimagine Christian witness in the light of COVID? Will we survive the impact of the virtual church? Will we be able to assess the merits and the pitfalls of virtual evangelism? I know already many people are thinking in those terms. How do we now use the technology to speak the message of Christ in very different ways? And how do we assess and capitalize on the church's witness in the offering of a pandemic? Old friend once reminded me of the witnessing which the early church did. Send in the parabolani. The parabolani were the kind of emergency hit squad the church sent out into disaster zones back in the early to middle-age days of the church. And we have seen many examples of missionary discipleship responding to the threat of pandemic. I think the danger, though, is of reverting to new ways of doing ecclesial discipleship. That is a way of being Christians who, if you like, upgrade Christian activism and mission. But I think it will also be good for us to explore ways in which we practice new forms of discipleship, which avoids what I would describe as Christian compliance. Yes, prayer is important, evangelism, the core, personal Bible study, etc., at the core. But I fear an approach to missionary discipleship which locks us into ecclesial Christian compliance, the discipline of the Christian mind. When I was a pastor, I was one of those for 10 years before the church got smart and I had to move on. I remember preaching sermons about disciples being disciplined. I used to say disciplined, that's what the word means, you know, get your act together and get your Bible study on track. And of course, we need to bear in mind the salient challenges of people like Bonhoeffer's discipleship and the challenge to cheap grace, against cheap grace, which we have to bear in mind. These core elements of our discipleship, our missionary discipleship of personal disciplines, simply cannot go awry in the aftermath or even the present experience of COVID. But, however, in the aftermath of COVID, we will also be tempted, I suspect, to bolt on new concerns about diversity. Black Lives Matter. How do we now transplant that motive, that war cry, that humanitarian cry in the concept of a missionary discipleship? I think David Swanson wrote a book recently called Rediscipling the White Church is right when he says that it's not just about diversity, it goes right back to the fundamental issue of what we mean by discipling. So he talks about rediscipling a white church in the context of the UK and of the USA. So I think it's important that COVID gives us an opportunity to reassess the mechanics, the disciplines of discipleship. But I hope it's not a bit like, I don't know, buying a Lamborghini for someone who was trained to drive at a maximum speed of 30 miles per hour on a motorway. And I don't think that's what we're being asked to consider. So let me tell you where my mind goes to when I think about missionary discipling in the COVID context. Because in our context today, the more critical undertone has been thrown up for us by the George Floyd murder and everything which has happened in this flow. This is a more significant missiological and discipling issue because it has the need for racial justice as a defining issue for church and society. And more than our response to the technology or the pandemic in itself, I think it will be the church's response to the call for justice which will matter to the recipients of our mission enterprise, and certainly to millennials and Black insiders who have regarded issues of identity and race as the defining issue. So racial justice has become a defining issue for the church's right to be a missionary agent to the world. And church leaders, I think, are going to have to learn an entire new way of being a missionary as a result of the pandemic. We have, in fact, learned entire vocabularies, haven't we? Equalities, vocabulary, passive racism, all that kind of stuff. And in the US, the impact of COVID and the impact of the George Floyd affair has gone to the very center of our electoral and political processes. But this was also the context in which the church first experienced discipleship. And I think this is really fundamental if we are to have an overall and honest reappraisal of being a missionary disciple in the context of COVID, because the early church did discipleship, learned discipleship, pioneered discipleship, exercised missionary discipleship in the context of power, race, ethnicity, gender, and justice, which totally shaped the New Testament missionary paradigm. And I think the great challenge of New Testament discipleship formation was the task of spreading the good news of Jesus and his kingdom without creating imperial forms of cultural compliance. That was the central challenge to the church. That was the soil in which discipleship was birthed. And this has to be the case, doesn't it? Because the Christian message was and is a global one. And the church is therefore called to be missionary disciples entirely in the context of racial, ethnic, geopolitical differences. We simply cannot avoid it. So Jesus gave us two injunctions, which actually summarizes this. Matthew 28, we know well, go into all the world and make disciples of all people. And then there is that geopolitical and cultural command of Acts 1:8. You're going to be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the end of the age. And I think that Christendom has subliminally reinterpreted this to mean something like, go into all the world and make Protestants, Baptists, Pentecostals, Anglicans, Catholics, evangelicals, Orthodox of all people. And this means that our missional discipling strategies have often created ecclesial compliance, which is not true to the New Testament at all. And this means how we do missional formation, education, becomes really, really important. I had long arguments as a member of a Black Pentecostal group who took most of its Sunday school and educational material direct from southern states of America. Cleveland, Tennessee sent us all our Sunday school material and our youth materials, and we sung from the church hymnal. And before you knew it, you were a black-white guy, black-white gal, trying to do discipleship in the racial and political realities of the United Kingdom, where the material you were getting to formulate your discipling had nothing to do with your experience. And I think, therefore, Dallas Willard in The Divine Conspiracy sums it up really nicely. Go, therefore, into every ethnic group and help them become my students. Robert Beckford, some of us will know, advocates this rather radical idea of exorcising the bewitched missionary formularies and training paradigms which affected all forms of missionary discipleship from the Middle Ages into our present time. I think he's got a point. I'm not so much concerned about white imperialism in terms of the bewitchment, but I am concerned, I think, about the formation of missionary discipleship, which has come from elsewhere and fails to inform the political, cultural, realities of the 21st century, or even the particular situation in which we find ourselves. So I think the call is to reimagine Christian formation. And more than anything else, this is what our contemporary context is screaming out for. A reimagining of the missionary disciple as a person or a people group who are willing to learn together about new ways of presenting Jesus effectively to the world, new ways of making him known in the shifting political ethnographies where the kingdom of God touches down in the human condition. Great little book by a guy called Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline. It's really about how you create a learning organization. And in that, at the very top end of the book, he introduces this idea of metanoia, a shifting of the mind. And here is how he explains it. To grasp the idea of metanoia is to grasp the deeper meaning of learning. For learning involves a fundamental shift or movement of mind. Learning has to become synonymous with taking in information, not just looking at it or reflecting on it, but actually internalizing and ingesting information in such a way that it reshapes our response to our discipleship. Willie Jennings, if you haven't come across him, is a great guy to bump into. He's got a couple of books. The one I've just finished feeding from is a thing called After Whiteness, and Education in Belonging. And what he expresses, I think, is really germane to our challenge of missionary discipleship in a post-COVID context. Here's what he says. Too many scholars believe in rigorous thinking and banish feelings and teach that a thinking subject wars against a feeling subject. Or to put it another way, he says, an intellectual form that performed white masculine self-sufficiency, a way of being in the world that aspires to exhibit possession, mastery, and control of knowledge first, and of oneself second, and if possible, of one's world. That kind of discipleship formation, he's saying, needs to be put elsewhere. Anthony Reddy in his book, Is God Colorblind, talks about proverbial wisdom. And I think these offer us different paradigms which probably come closer to the New Testament model of being a missionary disciple. Why? Because it was all about learning. The disciple, the missionary disciple, isn't just one who presents biblical propositions to the culture it engages with, but one which learns from and gives back, one which is ever in a process of discovery, both of God and of the context in which God has called us. So I think the missionary discipleship in the New Testament has some very important lessons for us. Let me flag up three things. The first is what I would describe as missionary discipleship being about personal proximity to Jesus. I love the fact that after Judas made a mess of him, of his missionary calling, they had to re-elect another disciple to replace him. And the Bible says in Acts 1:21, they chose someone who had been with Jesus the whole time. I just love that. They chose someone who had been with Jesus the whole time. Acts 4:13, the people took note of the apostles that they had been with Jesus. Can't go into this too deeply. I've only got 2 hours to present this talk to you. Little joke. But the question is this: how do we do discipleship training in such a way that people come away with the impression that they spent time with Jesus? There was this wonderful text in the Old Testament, isn't there? Exodus 21:5, where the slave is set free, but the slave decides to go back and be a slave. What does he say? I love my master and I don't want to leave. How do we get missionary disciples with that personal proximity to Jesus in our discipleship formation? Here's the second thing. Jesus said, learn from me. That's it. This is the missionary disciple in context to otherness. We don't have time here, but all Jesus was doing for a long time with his disciples was to teach them about presenting the gospel to otherness. I love to refer to what I call Jesus's Samaritanism. No, it wasn't just isolated teachings about the 10 lepers, one being a Samaritan who came back, the Samaritan woman at the well, the Good Samaritan. No, what Jesus was doing was actually exposing his disciples to the other. And his Samaritan policy, his Samaritanism, was to say, if you're going to go into all the world, you better get to spend time with Samaritans who you don't know, even hate. In fact, why don't we go and spend 3 days in Samaria with the woman from the well? A huge cultural shock. Acts 6, Greeks and Jewish widows. Acts 11, Peter and Cornelius. And supremely, the church in Antioch. Acts chapter 11 into 15. Why did the disciples send out that amazing letter to all the churches across Syria in Acts 15? We lay no further burdens on you except these few things. That's moving away from ecclesial discipleship and setting Gentiles free to be Gentiles. Why? Because the Antioch story contains very powerful New Testament paradigms of missionary discipling. They were powerful, they were financially strong, they had great gifted people from all kinds of cultural context. And hey, would you believe this is where disciples were first called Christians? Yeah, they had the brand. And I think the name change is no accident. Whether it was given to them or whether they assumed it for themselves, I think this was the church in Antioch saying, we will not be bound by cultural compliance of Judaism. And the name change relocates the disciples, not as second-class Jews, but as gifted missionary Gentiles who were followers of Christ. This is the Christianization of missionary discipleship. So let me leave you with some practical questions, because I know the CTE constituency likes practical questions. I think the great task of Christian discipleship is what Pope Francis calls the joy of the gospel, the joy of the gospel. And this is creating new expressions of, this isn't just creating new expressions of cultural conformity and compliance to a dominant historic culture. It has to do with that missionary disciple shaped by a communion of experiences which responds to the spiritual and urgent needs of the people they meet. So here is some bullet points to finish with. 1, let's create discipling models with Jesus at the center. 2, let's do the eunuch witnessing to Philip. Who is educating whom? Let's pay attention, thirdly, to issues like Black liberation theology, reverse theology, those elements of formation we probably haven't been historically all that au fait with. Some of the work which people like Israel Olofinjana is doing in reverse mission well were taken on board. I'm not just saying that because Lucy is listening in. And then there's the intellectual desegregation of theological colleges. Let's desegregate our colleges where we only teach our liturgical formation, formats, and ideas, and bring in doctrines which include justice, human rights, diversity. And my final thing would be this: everyone and every training institution should have a Cornelius, somebody we spend 2 days traveling to see in order to be exposed that God has also revealed himself to missionary disciples who are Roman centurions and totally unlike us. Thank you.
Joel, thank you so much for sharing with us. We're going to go into breakout rooms, but before we do, we've had a few questions in the chat box. We obviously can't ask you all of them, but can I ask you one of them, which has come from Matthew. He says, you said, be ready to venture into otherness. Yes, he agrees, but how to get there from unreadiness? If you perhaps could give us a quick response to that before we go into some breakout rooms.
Well, I think if we haven't been positioned into readiness over the last 6 months, we're in real trouble. And I think readiness is the awareness that there is something missing in what has been normative for us for many years, that restlessness. I think readiness is about recognizing restlessness, recognizing that the world and society and other Christian communities are asking me questions I have not fully considered. And so readiness, I don't think means having all the answers up my sleeve. It means a restlessness, a willingness to acknowledge that something needs to move and I need to do some learning. I think that's happening. I've never, ever been so confronted with Christian leaders and Christian individuals who are asking me, what shall I read? And I think a great part of readiness is recognizing I don't have the answers, but I need to find some.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful.